The sea has always carried stories. Some are of triumph, others of tragedy, and just a few linger in that uneasy space between the two. Among them, none has haunted the imagination quite like the tale of the Mary Celeste. She was not the largest ship, nor the most famous before her voyage in 1872. She carried no kings, no treasure, no armies. She was an ordinary brigantine, built to haul cargo across the Atlantic, commanded by an honest captain with his wife, child, and crew. And yet, from the moment she was found drifting, abandoned, her people vanished without trace. She ceased to be ordinary. What happened in those empty corridors? Why did seasoned sailors, a devoted captain, a mother and child, step away from safety into silence? Why did the ship survive when her people did not? The answers have never been found. What remains are fragments: a torn sail, a missing lifeboat, a logbook gone silent, 9 leaking barrels of alcohol, a reputation blackened by rumor and myth. Out of these fragments, the world has woven legends of pirates, mutiny, storms, madness, ghosts. This story is not simply about a ship. It is about fear, about faith, about the fragile thread of reason when weighed against the vast indifference of the sea. It is about how history becomes myth, how truth becomes story, and how some mysteries refuse to die. The Mary Celeste did not sink on that December day. She drifted into history. And she drifts still. Chapter 1. The Sea of Silence. The ocean is a liar. It pretends to be calm, to shimmer with peace, but those who live by it know better. The Atlantic, on that December morning in 1872, was smooth, a glassy expanse of green-gray swells beneath a winter sky. To the crew of the Dei Gratia, it was almost too calm enough to put a man on edge. Sailors are creatures of rhythm. They expect the slap of waves, the protest of ropes, the predictable violence of the sea. Silence unnerves them more than storms. Silence means something is wrong. It was early when the lookout in the crow's nest shouted. His cry split the air. Sail. Off the starboard bow. At first the sight was nothing unusual. A smudge on the horizon, a pale canvas against the sky. The Atlantic was busy in the 19th century, crowded with vessels carrying goods, passengers, dreams. But as the hours passed and the ships drew closer, Captain David Morehouse raised his spyglass and frowned. Through the lens, the approaching brigantine revealed herself like a corpse slowly surfacing from the depths. Her sails were ragged, flapping without discipline. Rigging dangled loose, ropes trailing like snapped veins. She listed slightly, not dangerously, but enough to suggest neglect. A ship alive, but moving without will. Like a body without a soul. And there, faint but undeniable, painted across the stern was her name, Mary Celeste. Morehouse knew the name. Many did. She had left New York just a month earlier, bound for Genoa, carrying barrels of alcohol. A fine vessel, captained by a man respected among sailors, Benjamin Briggs, devout, steady, experienced. Briggs was not the kind to vanish. He was the kind to survive. And yet here was his ship, staggering across the Atlantic like an orphaned child. Morehouse felt something twist in his gut. Abandoning ship is the last thing a sailor does. To leave a vessel adrift in mid-ocean requires desperation beyond words. Men cling to their ships as they would to their last breath. The ocean offers no forgiveness to those who step off without plan. What, then, had forced Briggs and his crew to flee? He ordered a boat lowered. The sailors rowed through the heaving water, their oars biting deep. Imagine their hearts as they drew close, as the details sharpened the creak of timbers, the sigh of torn canvas, the stench of brine, and something else, something faintly sour, like spoiled fruit. They reached her hull and gripped her sides. The boarding party climbed, boots thudding on deck. And then stillness. The deck was deserted. No voices, no footsteps, no captain's bark of orders. Only the wind through rigging, the hollow knock of rope against mast. They called out. The sound echoed, unanswered. They searched. And the further they went, the more the strangeness grew. The galley still held food. A meal appeared ready to be eaten, bread uncut, meat uncooked but prepared. Water and supplies were abundant. There was no sign of fire, no struggle, no spilled blood. The cabins were orderly, yet eerily so, as though life had been interrupted mid-breath. A sewing machine stood ready, a garment half-mended. A pipe rested on a table, ash still clinging to its bowl. Boots were left neatly by a bunk. The domesticity of it was suffocating. Whoever had lived here had expected to return. But the lifeboat was gone. And with it, all souls. Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 sailors. 11 lives erased. The captain's quarters offered only deeper questions. The bed was unmade, sheets twisted. Sarah Briggs's belongings were present, clothing, books, her sewing kit open, thread spooled like veins across the wood. Sophia's toys sat waiting for a child's hand. A doll. A tiny shoe. A mother's world left behind, unfinished. The ship's logbook was recovered. Its last entry dated 10 days earlier, recording the vessel's position. There was nothing sinister in the words. No storm, no mutiny, no plea for God's mercy scribbled in haste. Just the calm routine of navigation. And then silence. Down in the hold lay the cargo, 1701 barrels of industrial alcohol. 9 barrels had leaked, their staves swollen and stained. The sharp tang of spirits hung in the air. Was this the cause? Had fumes filled the cabins, frightening Briggs into evacuating? If so, why abandon ship completely when she remained seaworthy, her sails damaged but serviceable, her hull strong? As the sailors explored, the sense of intrusion thickened. They walked through a ghost of life, rooms that seemed to breathe memories. Every object testified to presence, yet absence screamed louder. To step on that deck was to stand in a tomb without bodies. Have you ever entered a room just after someone has left? The warmth still lingers. A chair pushed back. A cup half drunk. You feel them there, though they are gone. Multiply that by 11 lives, by weeks at sea, by the vast void of the Atlantic pressing against every timber, and you will taste what the men of the Dei Gratia felt. They found no answers, only riddles. They towed the Mary Celeste toward Gibraltar, a silent companion, a second ship behind them gliding like a shadow. And all the while, whispers stirred among the crew. Whispers of foul play, of madness, of the supernatural. Sailors are men of superstition. They carry talismans, spit at omens, whisper to the sea. To bring a ghost ship behind you is to invite nightmares. And as news spread ashore, those whispers swelled into legends. The press seized the story, ink dripping with speculation. The world was fascinated. Why had the crew left? Where had they gone? Why had they never returned? Even now, a century and a half later, we ask the same questions. Pause here for a moment. Imagine standing on that deck yourself. Picture the horizon, an endless desert of water. Hear the sails flap, limp and hopeless. Smell the sharp sting of leaking alcohol mixed with salt and damp wood. Touch the cold rail beneath your hand, and all around you absence. The ship is whole. The world is calm. And yet, everyone is gone. Would you dare climb into that lifeboat and leave her? Or would you cling to the timbers, praying for survival? Captain Briggs chose to leave. Or perhaps he was forced. Either way, the Mary Celeste became more than wood and sail. She became a story. And stories, once born, never die. The silence of the Atlantic that morning was not empty. It was filled with questions, with fear, with the weight of lives cut adrift. The Mary Celeste drifted not only on water, but into history. And history, like the sea, never truly lets go. Chapter 2. The Captain's Promise. Benjamin Spooner Briggs was not a man to invite mystery. He was steady, devout, a New Englander cut from the granite of Massachusetts soil. Born in 1835, he grew up in a world where the sea was both livelihood and destiny. New Bedford, his home, was a place where boys dreamed not of land but of sails, where fathers told their sons that fortune and ruin both lived on the water. His family was respectable, his reputation spotless. He was the sort of man other sailors trusted without hesitation. If you imagine him, picture a man in his 30s lean from years of shipboard life, with city eyes that read horizons and storms with equal care. He was a man of faith, carrying a Bible on his voyages, not out of superstition but conviction. His letters to his family reveal a gentle, thoughtful character, far from the stereotype of hard-drinking, brawling seaman. He was not reckless. He was not foolish. So why did such a man vanish without a trace? Let's step back to understand the promise that brought him to the deck of the Mary Celeste. By 1872, Briggs had already tasted the sea's dangers. He had captained other ships, navigated storms, endured the endless monotony of calm seas and the sudden terror of squalls. He had married Sarah Cobb, a woman as devout and steady as himself. Their union was tender, their letters affectionate. Together, they built a life anchored by faith and family. When their daughter Sophia was born, Briggs wrote with joy of the blessing she was. The decision to take Sarah and Sophia on this voyage was not casual. It was, in many ways, a statement. Briggs had been considering leaving the sea altogether, settling into a quieter, land-based life. The endless risks of the Atlantic weighed on him. But before that chapter could close, there was this journey, New York to Genoa, cargo of alcohol barrels, routine but profitable. He would command the Mary Celeste, and he would not go alone. He would bring his wife and child, perhaps as a gesture of trust, perhaps as a bridge between sea and shore. It was a promise, one last voyage together, then perhaps a different life. Picture the preparations. The wharves of New York bustling, cranes swinging barrels into the hold, sailors laughing, shouting, cursing in a dozen languages. The smell of tar, rope, horses, seaweed. Sarah, boarding with her delicate belongings, books, a sewing kit, small comforts to soften the harsh wood of the cabin. Sophia clutching her toy, wide-eyed at the towering masts and the forest of sails above. To a child, a ship is a kingdom. To a mother, it is both home and prison. Briggs must have felt pride. The Mary Celeste was not new, but she was seaworthy, a brigantine of 282 tons, strong and capable of carrying her cargo across the Atlantic. She had been refitted after earlier troubles, her timbers reinforced. She was a vessel a captain could trust, a vessel a man might promise to his family as safe passage. He wrote letters before departure. In them, his voice was calm, filled with the mundane details of voyage and the quiet hope of reunion. There was no hint of foreboding, no dread. If the sea whispered warning, He did not hear it, or perhaps, as sailors often do, he trusted his faith more than omens. The crew he chose was capable. 7 men, competent, experienced. None were strangers to him. Briggs was careful with his selections. A captain's authority rests not only on skill, but on trust. Mutiny, disobedience, these were always risks. Briggs picked men he believed would follow his command. And so, in November of 1872, the Mary Celeste departed New York Harbor. Imagine the scene. The harbor choked with smoke from steamships, sails crowding the skyline, gulls shrieking overhead, dock workers waving, children pointing, wives dabbing eyes with kerchiefs. The great Atlantic stretched ahead, cold, endless, merciless. For Briggs, it was familiar. For Sarah, perhaps daunting. For Sophia, it was an adventure. The first weeks at sea were uneventful. The log recorded steady progress. Weather fair. Cargo secure. Provisions plentiful. Briggs wrote with confidence. Nothing in those days suggested doom. The promise still held. He would carry his family safely across, deliver his cargo, and perhaps retire to a quieter life ashore. But the ocean is patient. It waits. The ship that would later be found adrift was, in those days, full of life. The deck clattered with boots, men shouted orders, sails snapped, ropes strained. The galley smelled of salt pork, bread baking, coffee brewing. Laughter echoed at night, pipes glowing in the dark. Sarah might have sat in her cabin, sewing, reading aloud from her Bible. Sophia's small footsteps would have padded along the narrow corridors, her voice a high counterpoint to the deep rumble of men. There is a strange intimacy to life at sea. 11 souls bound together, sharing every breath, every danger. Quarrels flare and fade. Bonds form quickly. A ship is not only wood and sail, it is a floating village, a fragile world unto itself. Think of Briggs, standing at the wheel, scanning the horizon. What thoughts crossed his mind? Pride in his vessel? Gratitude for calm seas? The weight of responsibility, his wife, his child, his crew, all lives resting on his decisions? A captain is more than a sailor. He is father, judge, protector. His promise was not only to deliver cargo. His promise was to bring them all safely home. Yet by December, that promise lay broken. The ship was found without him, without them, drifting like a riddle carved in salt and wood. What intervened? Did Briggs misjudge the danger of leaking alcohol barrels, fearing explosion? Did he abandon ship in haste, expecting to return? Did a storm scatter them? Did panic override experience? Or was there something darker, violence, mutiny, despair? What makes the story of the Mary Celeste so haunting is not only the absence of answers, but the character of the man at its center. Briggs was not reckless. He was not cruel. He was, by every account, the sort of captain who inspired loyalty and trust. His disappearance shatters expectation. It makes the mystery sharper. Because if even a man like Briggs, steady, devout, competent, could vanish, then what hope is there for the rest of us against the vast indifference of the sea? It is this thought, this crack in the promise, that has haunted historians, sailors, and storytellers for more than a century. The Mary Celeste was a ship, but Benjamin Briggs was a man. And behind every man lies a story of family, faith, duty, and promise. His promise ended not with fulfillment, but with silence. A silence that echoes louder than any storm. Chapter 3. The Crew That Vanished. When history remembers the Mary Celeste, it often reduces the story to a ship, a captain, a vanished family. But the truth is larger. 11 souls vanished with her, and 9 of them were not famous, not remembered in books, not captured in portraits. They were sailors, ordinary men, whose lives began in fishing villages and dockside taverns, whose calloused hands bore the marks of rope and salt. Their names are written in the ship's roster, but their stories, like their bodies, were swallowed by the Atlantic. And yet, to understand the ghost ship, we must try to breathe life into them. The quiet heroes of the sea. The first mate was Albert G. Richardson. He was American, trusted enough to be Briggs's right hand. A mate on a ship is no small role. It is both burden and honor. He was likely young, sharp-eyed, with ambitions of someday commanding his own vessel. Briggs would not have chosen him lightly. Trust is currency on the ocean. To hand over command during a watch, to sleep knowing another man guides your ship that requires respect. The steward was Edward William Head, responsible for provisions, the careful balance of food, water, and comfort. A steward's role is both practical and psychological. Hungry men grow restless, thirsty men grow mutinous. Head kept the lifeline steady. Then there was Volkert Lorentzen, the second mate, a Dane. Northern seamen were common on transatlantic voyages, tall, strong, bred by harsher seas. With him came 2 young seamen from his village, Arian Martins and Brosnahan. They were not only crew, but kin of trust. Sailors often recruited neighbors, cousins, friends. The sea is less terrifying when you face it alongside a familiar face. Add to this mix a handful of others, ordinary seamen, their names fading from memory, their pay agreed upon in contracts signed at the docks. Men who laughed in taverns the night before departure, who kissed wives or mothers goodbye, who promised to send wages home. These men were not nameless to Briggs. They were not expendable. He had chosen them with care. He needed loyalty, skill, men who would endure storms, monotony, and fear without breaking. A captain builds his crew as a mason builds a wall, stone by stone, each one chosen to hold against pressure. And then, Sarah and little Sophia. Imagine the sailors' eyes when they first saw a 2-year-old toddling about the deck, clutching a doll, her curls blowing in the salt wind. Sailors are rough men, but children soften them. Many would have crouched to make faces at her, offered her small trinkets, carved her toys from scrap wood. She must have been the ship's laughter, the voice that lightened the monotony. To them, she was not a passenger, she was everyone's child. The last goodbyes. What did their farewells look like? In New York, the docks were alive, with sound horses clattering, hawkers shouting, stink of fish and tar. Families gathered as the crew prepared to board. Perhaps Richardson clasped hands with a younger brother, promising to return. Perhaps Lorenson's countrymen, fresh from Denmark, grinned nervously as they adjusted to American crowds. Edward Head might have hugged his wife or sister, giving quiet reassurance. Did they know? Did they feel the prickle of unease, that sailor's sixth sense that whispers when a voyage will not end as expected? Or did they board with confidence, thinking only of wages earned and horizons crossed? One by one, they walked the gangplank. Boots on timber, eyes on sails, hearts tethered to land but pulled inevitably to sea. And then the ropes were cast, the ship edged from dock, and land slipped away. For many, it was the last time they saw it. Life aboard. To step onto a brigantine is to enter a world of order. Watches run in rhythm, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. The bells strike. Men rise, haul ropes, climb rigging, adjust sails, check cargo. Others sleep in narrow bunks, their dreams broken by creaks and groans. Meals are simple: salted pork, hardtack, coffee, beans. Laughter fills the galley, quarrels flare and die quickly. Sarah might have tried to soften the rough edges, perhaps offering kind words, perhaps sharing in prayer. Briggs read scripture daily. It is easy to imagine the crew bowing heads as verses were spoken over the sound of waves. Sophia's giggles might have mingled with the low murmur of men telling stories of home. And yet beneath routine, the sea always loomed. A sudden storm could rise without warning. A rope could snap, a mast could crack, a man could fall. Every sailor lived with the knowledge that life hung by a thread, and that thread was woven of wood, canvas, and trust. The vanishing. And then nothing. When the Mary Celeste was found, the crew's possessions were still aboard. Clothing, pipes, tools. Not the signs of men who deserted. Not the marks of mutiny. Their wages, their small treasures they had left them behind. Only the lifeboat was missing. What terror, what urgency could drive all hands, captain, wife, child, seasoned crew, to abandon ship in such haste? Imagine the scene: Briggs giving the order, his voice calm but urgent. Men lowering the lifeboat, glancing at one another, confused but obedient. Sarah clutching Sophia, eyes wide with fear. The crew looking back one last time at the ship they had sworn to protect. The ropes cut, the boat rocking, the Mary Celeste drifting slowly away. And then the Atlantic. No trace of them was ever found. No lifeboat, no body washed ashore. 11 souls erased. Echoes of the forgotten. History is cruel in what it remembers. Briggs's name endures. Sarah and Sophia are spoken of with pity. But Richardson, Head, Lawrenson, Martins, Brosnahan, they have faded into silence. No statues, no memorials, no novels penned about them. And yet, they were as vital to the story as any. They hauled the ropes, cooked the meals, scrubbed the decks, kept the watch. Without them, the Mary Celeste would not have sailed at all. Their families waited. Letters that never came. Wives who stood at windows scanning harbors. Mothers who prayed over empty chairs. Children who grew up hearing only the whisper, "Your father was lost at sea." And that is what haunts most of all, not only the absence of explanation, but the absence of closure. The Atlantic does not return its dead. So when we speak of the Mary Celeste, let us not only think of the ship, or the mystery, or the captain. Let us remember the men whose names history almost forgot, men who lived, worked, laughed, prayed, and then were gone. Because the ghost ship was never just wood and sail. It was human, and it carried not only cargo, but promises, families, laughter, and lives. Lives that vanished as completely as if the ocean itself had swallowed their names. Chapter 4. The Abandoned Deck. The rowboat bumped against the hull with a hollow thunk. The men of the Dei Gratia steadied themselves, gripping oars slick with salt. Above them, the dark shape of the Mary Celeste loomed, timbers weather-stained, sails ragged, ropes dangling like torn veins. The Atlantic lapped at her sides with lazy indifference. To board her was to climb into a question. Picture the scene. The sailors, hardened men used to storms and solitude, glanced at one another with unease. Boarding a derelict vessel was no simple matter. It was dangerous, sometimes cursed. There were tales of ships carrying plague, of vessels abandoned after mutiny, of traps left by pirates. But duty outweighed fear. If the ship was salvageable, they would claim her. And curiosity pulled stronger than dread. A rope ladder dangled down her side. One man grasped it, knuckles white, and began to climb. His boots scraped against wood. The higher he went, the colder the silence grew. At last, he swung himself onto the deck. His footsteps echoed alone, unanswered. The others followed, one by one, until they stood upon the Mary Celeste, strangers in a world left behind. And then, the searching began. The first impressions. The deck told its own story. Some sails hung, others flapped uselessly, torn by wind. The rigging was slack, as though abandoned mid-task. The wheel was unmanned, its spokes turning lazily as the ocean nudged it. No bloodstains. No splintered wood from battle. No bodies. Just emptiness. The men spread out, their eyes darting, hands gripping tools as if weapons. They called out, "Hello, the ship!" Their voices cracking the still air. No reply. Only the groan of timber, the low sigh of canvas, the mocking cry of a gull wheeling overhead. Imagine the tension in that silence. These were men accustomed to noise, the chatter of shipmates, the rhythm of hammers, the constant chorus of a working vessel. Now, silence pressed like a weight. It was the silence of a church abandoned, of a home left mid-meal, of something unfinished. Below decks. They descended into the cabins, lanterns swinging shadows across narrow walls. The air was stale, tinged with salt, and a faint chemical tang, the sour sting of alcohol fumes from the leaking barrels below. It stung the nose, burned faintly in the throat. The galley was unnerving. Provisions remained. Flour, salted meat, water casks untouched. No sign of scarcity, no reason to abandon ship for want of supplies. A kettle sat unused. Plates were stacked, bowls clean, knives and spoons ready for the next meal. Life interrupted, paused mid-breath. In the captain's cabin, the bedclothes were rumpled as though Sarah Briggs had risen suddenly. Her sewing kit lay open, thread spilling across the table. A book rested nearby, its page marked by a folded scrap of paper. In one corner, little Sophia's toys waited silently, a doll, a small shoe. Objects of innocence, now haunted by absence. The sailors stood in that cabin longer than anywhere else, uneasy, imagining the mother and child who should have been there. The logbook lay on the desk. Its last entry was dated November 25th, 10 days earlier. Nothing ominous, only a record of position, wind, progress. Then silence. 10 days of unrecorded fate. The cargo hold. They lifted the hatch and descended into the hold. The stench grew sharper, unmistakable. 9 barrels of alcohol had leaked, staining the floor, saturating the air. Industrial spirits, volatile, flammable, dangerous. Was this the reason? Had Briggs feared explosion, ordered evacuation? And yet, the rest of the cargo remained intact. The ship's timbers bore no scorch marks, no cracks of fire. It was dangerous, yes, but not immediately fatal. And if they had fled in fear, why had they not returned? The lifeboat. Back on deck, one detail glared. The lifeboat was gone. The davits showed it had been lowered carefully, not torn away by storm. Whoever left the Mary Celeste had done so deliberately, lowering themselves into the Atlantic. But why? The seas were calm when the ship was found. The vessel was seaworthy. To abandon her seemed madness. The emotional weight. Pause here. Imagine being one of those sailors. Your boots scuff the planks. Your hand touches the rail. Everywhere, signs of life linger. A pipe rests where a man once smoked, ash still clinging to the bowl. A needle sits threaded, awaiting the next stitch. A Bible lies open, words fading in lantern glow. You smell sweat and brine, as though the crew has only just stepped out. You wait, half expecting them to return any moment, faces emerging from the shadows. But they never do. The ship breathes absence. Superstition creeps in. Was it mutiny? Murder? Did they anger God? Was it something not human at all? The sea is a breeding ground for legends. Men whisper of monsters, of spirits, of the cursed. And here, on the Mary Celeste, every missing voice seemed to echo with the unspoken, "We should not be here." Taking her in tow. At last, they faced a choice. Leave her to drift or claim her. By maritime law, salvage was a prize valuable, worth risk. They chose to take her in tow. Ropes creaked, sails adjusted, and slowly the ghost ship followed the Dei Gratia. But the men were not at ease. To drag the Mary Celeste behind them was to drag a coffin, a curse, a question without answer. At night, sailors glanced over shoulders, eyes fixed on her shadowed bulk gliding silently in moonlight. She seemed alive, watching. A companion not of flesh, but of mystery. The birth of a legend. When they reached Gibraltar, the world was waiting. News spread quickly, an abandoned vessel, cargo intact, crew vanished. Newspapers seized the story. Speculation exploded. Theories of mutiny, piracy, storm, madness, even paranormal forces filled columns. The Mary Celeste became more than wood and sail. She became a legend. And it all began with that moment when the sailors of the Dei Gratia set foot on her abandoned deck, lantern light trembling, hearts pounding, silence pressing down like the weight of the sea itself. Chapter 5. The Missing Logbook. On every ship, the logbook is its beating heart. It is where a captain speaks to the future, where he records not only position and weather, but the pulse of the voyage. Storms, sightings, discipline, repairs, all live in those neat lines of ink. The ship may creak, the sails may tear, the crew may quarrel, but the log keeps steady time, unbroken, unblinking. A logbook is continuity. It is presence. It says, we were here, we passed this way, we lived these hours. So when the sailors of the Dei Gratia found the Mary Celeste's logbook, the first thing they did was turn to the final entry. It was dated 25 November, 1872. The ship had recorded her position near the Azores, about 400 miles from where she was eventually found. Weather fine. Winds moderate. Nothing unusual. Nothing ominous. Just the plain, steady hand of Captain Briggs doing his duty. And then nothing. 10 days vanished. 10 days unrecorded. 10 days in which something happened that pulled 11 souls from their vessel and scattered them into silence. The ink stopped, and history began to guess. The silence between entries. Imagine flipping those pages. Each entry orderly, crisp, almost monotonous. Course so-and-so, wind steady, all well. Day after day, the rhythm of a voyage at sea. You can almost hear the scratching of Briggs's pen, the steady concentration of a man trained to precision. And then, abruptly, blankness. 10 pages unwritten, 10 days swallowed by absence. What was happening during those days? Was there tension on board? Were men whispering about the leaking barrels? Did Sarah pace the cabin, anxious for Sophia's safety? Did Briggs weigh choices late at night, Bible open beside him, fear gnawing at his faith? A logbook cannot tell us what it does not hold. And yet, in its silence, it tells more than words could. It tells us that something broke the chain of routine. It tells us that normalcy ended. The wait of 10 days. 10 days is not a small span on the ocean. In 10 days, a storm can rise and fall. A fever can strike and kill. Supplies can dwindle. Fear can grow until it consumes reason. A captain can wrestle with decisions, torn between duty and terror. For Briggs to stop writing, either he was prevented or he chose to leave. The question is, which? Consider the possibilities. Perhaps the fumes from the alcohol grew overwhelming. 9 barrels had leaked, their contents seeping into the hold, vapor rising into the closed airless spaces. Did the crew feel dizzy, sick, unable to breathe? Did Briggs order evacuation for safety, intending to return once the danger passed? If so, why did he not record the crisis? A captain documents. It is instinct. For him not to write suggests haste, panic, or something worse. Or perhaps the ship faced sudden violence, a waterspout, a rogue wave, an accident that forced immediate response. In the chaos, the pen was set aside, never lifted again. The captain's hand. Historians who examined the log noted the handwriting was steady. No sign of distress in those last lines. The words were calm, as if nothing unusual stirred. That calmness unsettles more than alarm would. If the final entry had read, "Storm approaching," God help us, we would nod, understanding. But instead, it reads like any other day. And then, silence. Doesn't that unsettle you more? To think that catastrophe can arrive, not with trumpet blasts, but with the soft continuation of routine? One day, ordinary, the next erased. Isn't that, in truth, how most disappearances happen? Not with warning, but with the comfort of normality, shattered without notice. The missing pages of memory. The Mary Celeste's log is not the only record. Briggs also kept a personal journal, letters, notes. None were ever found. Sarah may have written, too, her impressions, her prayers. Imagine what those pages might have revealed. The fears of a mother, the tenderness of a wife, the weary hopes of a sailor. Lost, like the voices that wrote them. And so, we are left with a document that is both present and absent. A logbook intact, yet incomplete. A story begun, but unfinished. The human element. Think of it this way. The logbook is like a clock that suddenly stops ticking. We hold it in our hands, still warm from the cabin, ink still dark, the smell of sea and oil clinging to its pages. We trace the last words, knowing they are not only words but the final heartbeat of 11 lives. After this, no more. After this, only speculation. The sailors of the Dei Gratia must have felt that weight as they turned the pages. They were not scholars, not historians. They were men of the sea. They knew what it meant when a log fell silent. It meant that something had gone terribly wrong. And as they stood in that quiet cabin, lantern light flickering over the captain's handwriting, they must have felt a chill. Not from the Atlantic breeze, but from the realization that they were holding the last testimony of people who had vanished into nothing. A question passed down. The missing logbook entries became more than a curiosity. They became the center of the mystery. Every theory storm, mutiny, explosion, piracy, madness had to reckon with that gap. 10 days of silence. We, too, wrestle with it. What happened in that space? What would the pages have said? Did Briggs write a desperate line, torn out later, lost to the sea? Did Sarah pen a final prayer for Sophia, her hand trembling as she clutched her child? Did the crew leave messages behind, scratched into wood, now washed away? We do not know. We will never know. And that is why the logbook matters so deeply. It is the bridge between certainty and legend. It is the point where history dissolves into story. Closing the log. When the Mary Celeste was brought to Gibraltar, investigators studied the log. They examined the handwriting, the ink, the dates. They asked questions, probed, doubted. But they found no clue beyond the silence itself. The log closed on 25 November. History closed with it. Everything after is conjecture, rumor, myth. And so the logbook, meant to record truth, became instead the most haunting silence in maritime history. Chapter 6. Theories at Sea. By the time the Mary Celeste reached Gibraltar, she was more than a ship. She was a question. And questions, especially unanswered ones, attract theories the way lanterns attract moths. The court of inquiry gathered. Officials peered over charts, sailors whispered in taverns, journalists inked columns with speculation. Everyone wanted to solve the riddle. Everyone wanted to say, "I know what happened out there." But the sea is generous only with mystery. Whisper pirates. The first and most obvious suspicion was piracy. The Atlantic still knew predators in 1872. The Barbary corsairs of earlier centuries were gone, but brigands lingered on remote waters, ready to seize cargo, ransom crews, vanish into hidden coves. Imagine the scene, as some pictured it, a dark hull on the horizon. Men armed with cutlasses and pistols, faces swathed in scarves. A swift boarding, shouts, gunfire, terror. The crew of the Mary Celeste overpowered, Briggs cut down, Sarah clutching Sophia as rough hands dragged them to a waiting boat. The pirates plundered, and yet where was the plunder? The ship's cargo of alcohol remained intact. The provisions were untouched. No valuables were missing. Pirates do not abandon spoils. And more damning still, no sign of struggle scarred the decks. No splintered wood, no blood. Only silence. So the theory faltered. Pirates, after all, leave scars. The Mary Celeste bore none. Murmurs of mutiny. Then came the darker whisper, mutiny. Sailors turning against their captain, weary of discipline, tempted by cargo. It is the nightmare of every commander that the trust-binding ship to crew might snap, unleashing violence. Some pictured it so, Richardson, the first mate, seizing power. Or Lawrenson and his countrymen, plotting. Knives drawn in the night. Briggs forced to abandon ship, his family with him. The mutineers steering toward freedom, only to vanish themselves. But this, too, unraveled under scrutiny. Briggs was respected, his crew carefully chosen. No signs of violence appeared, no broken furniture, no bloodstains, no hasty departure of mutineers carrying away loot. Their possessions remained. Their wages, their small treasures. Who commits mutiny and then leaves everything behind? The sailors of the Mary Celeste were not men of legend. They were ordinary men, chasing wages. Their lives did not whisper of rebellion. The court leaned away from mutiny, though suspicion lingers in the shadows, because mutiny is a story people like to tell. Storms and the sea's fury. Another possibility was storm. The Atlantic in November and December is restless, breeding sudden squalls, rogue waves, waterspouts. Some suggested a massive seaquake or freak wave struck the vessel, flooding the deck, terrifying Briggs into abandoning ship. Picture it, night on the Atlantic. The ship heaving violently, sails splitting, waves crashing over deck. Men shouting in panic. Briggs, clutching his wife and daughter, ordering the lifeboat lowered. They flee into the boiling sea, certain the Mary Celeste is doomed. But she is not. She rights herself. The storm passes. And she drifts on, empty. It is a plausible tale. And yet, the damage on board did not match it. The ship was wet, yes. Some sails torn. But not destroyed. She was seaworthy. She had survived, whatever the sea threw. If Briggs abandoned her, it was not because she was broken. It was because he believed mistakenly that she would not last. And here lies the cruel irony. She was strong enough to survive. They were not. The fumes of the hold. Investigators lingered over the cargo. 1701 barrels of raw alcohol. 9 had leaked. The stench was overpowering. Industrial spirits, volatile, explosive. Some argued Briggs, smelling the fumes, feared the ship would ignite. In haste, he ordered evacuation. The lifeboat was lowered. The plan was to tether it to the ship, wait until the fumes cleared, then return. But perhaps the rope snapped. Perhaps wind or wave carried them off. The lifeboat drifted, and the ship sailed on, leaving them behind. Alone on the Atlantic in a small boat, 11 souls vanished into horizon and hunger. This theory explains much. The absence of struggle. The careful lowering of the boat. The intact cargo. the silence. But it raises questions too. Briggs was experienced. Would he abandon his vessel so quickly? Would he risk wife and child on a small craft rather than trust the sturdier brigantine? Would fear of fumes outweigh the instinct of every sailor, never leave the ship unless it is sinking? And yet, panic changes logic. A captain with his family aboard, terrified of fire, might have chosen caution that turned into tragedy. The sea's madness. Others whispered of less tangible causes. Madness. Delirium. A creeping fear that infected the crew. Stories spread of sailors struck by sudden mania, of hallucinations born of exhaustion, of men driven to leaps into the sea by invisible voices. Was Briggs himself overcome? Did he imagine danger where none was? Did Sarah plead with him, fear for Sophia, urge him to flee? Did he order the lifeboat in a moment of frenzy, his steady judgment clouded by fumes, fatigue, or fear? Madness leaves no footprints. It explains everything and nothing. It cannot be disproven, and that makes it seductive. The supernatural whispers. And of course, beyond the courtroom and the scholar's desk, in taverns and back alleys, the supernatural was invoked. Sailors love their ghosts, their omens, their monsters. Some claimed sea serpents rose, coiled around the ship, dragged crew screaming into waves. Others muttered of spirits vengeful, unseen, punishing the crew. Some said the Mary Celeste sailed into a cursed patch of sea where time itself faltered. Nonsense? Perhaps. But the supernatural fills the void where logic fails. And the Mary Celeste had a void larger than most. The courts struggle. In Gibraltar, the inquiry wrestled with evidence. The judge himself grew suspicious, not of natural causes, but of the salvagers. He wondered if the crew of the Dei Gratia had played a darker role. Had they murdered, fabricated the story, claimed salvage unjustly? Yet no evidence supported it. The suspicion dissolved, leaving only questions. The court produced no answer. They concluded the ship was abandoned, but why, no one could say. Theories as comfort. And so the theories multiplied. Each one a way to tame the unknown. Pirates. Mutiny. Storm. Explosion. Madness. Ghosts. Each offered comfort, because even a terrifying explanation is easier to accept than none at all. But the truth, like the Atlantic, remains vast and indifferent. Theories are rafts we cling to in a sea of unknowing. Chapter 7. Natural Enemies. The sea has no mercy. It does not bargain, it does not forgive, it does not remember. Sailors know this better than anyone. For them, the ocean is both cradle and grave, a vast expanse where beauty and terror live side by side. One moment calm, the next a roaring wall of water rising higher than a church steeple. It is not difficult to imagine that the fate of the Mary Celeste and her crew was sealed not by pirates, not by mutiny, not by madness, but by the oldest enemy of all nature itself. The Atlantic, in winter, is not a gentle place. Storms brew swiftly, racing across from the Americas toward Europe. Winds howl like banshees, Waves crashed like collapsing buildings. Masts groaned under strain. A brigantine like the Mary Celeste, sturdy though she was, would have danced helplessly on such seas, her deck awash, her men clinging to rigging for their lives. Even the bravest captain might feel his heart quake as water roared across the planks, threatening to rip wife, child, and crew into the deep. Imagine a night of such fury. The sky black, stars erased by clouds, rain lashing with the sting of whips. The ship rolling, pitching, timbers groaning with every impact. A wave surges higher than the deckhouse, slamming across, sweeping barrels loose, tearing sails, snapping ropes. Sophia cries in terror. Sarah clutches her to her chest, Briggs shouting orders above the howl of the wind. The crew strains with every muscle to keep the brigantine upright. Fear courses through them like a second ocean. In such a moment, any man might make a desperate decision. Perhaps Briggs ordered the lifeboat lowered as a precaution, convinced the ship would not survive. Perhaps he hoped to tether it, ride out the storm with wife and child at his side, ready to abandon the vessel if she began to sink. But in the chaos, the rope snapped or was cut, and the small boat was swept away. The Mary Celeste, resilient after all, endured the storm. But the people she carried did not. There are those who speak of waterspouts, tornadoes of sea and wind, descending from clouds like great funnels. A waterspout could have struck suddenly, drenching the decks, terrifying all aboard. To untrained eyes, it might have looked like the ship itself was about to be split apart by fire and water. In panic, Briggs might have ordered evacuation, only to realize too late that the greater danger lay in the tiny boat they trusted. And then there are rogue waves, those mysterious walls of water that rise from nowhere, taller than houses, surging across the sea with unimaginable force. Even today, with satellite technology and modern ships, rogue waves remain a terror. In 1872, they were pure nightmare stories, whispered by sailors, half believed, half feared. A single rogue wave could have swept the deck, torn men from their posts, battered the ship so violently that Briggs, convinced she was breaking apart, abandoned her. Yet when calm returned, the brigantine floated on, empty but sound. The absence of catastrophic damage is what unsettles most. The Mary Celeste bore scars, wet decks, torn sails, disarray, but nothing like the ruin of a ship that had truly faced annihilation. She was alive, stubbornly afloat, as though mocking the men who had forsaken her. The cruel paradox is this: she was strong enough to survive, but they were not strong enough to believe in her strength. To understand the weight of such decisions, we must place ourselves in Briggs's shoes. A captain at sea is not a man of calm philosophy, he is a man of burden. 11 lives depended on him, and among them his wife and child. The Atlantic in fury is no place for measured thought. It is a place where instinct and terror seize the helm. When the waves tower, when the sky splits with lightning, when the timbers shudder as though about to crack, what promise of safety does reason offer? The lifeboat may have seemed salvation, and in choosing it, he chose his family above his ship. We like to think experience shields men from fear. That Briggs, seasoned, steady, would never yield to panic. But experience can cut both ways. He knew better than anyone what storms could do. He had seen the sea devour men whole. He had seen timbers break, ships founder, sailors vanish in foam. He carried those ghosts in memory. Perhaps in that storm he heard them whisper again, telling him the Mary Celeste would not survive. He listened and was wrong. The Atlantic has claimed more lives than war. It is the unseen battlefield where sailors fight, not enemies, but the elements. Lightning, wind, rogue seas, the sucking pull of the deep. It fights without malice, but also without pause. The sea is not cruel, it is indifferent. And indifference can feel like cruelty when lives are at stake. When we imagine the fate of the Mary Celeste, we must not forget this indifference. We crave explanations, pirates, mutiny, poison, monsters, because they feel tangible, graspable. But perhaps the truth was simply the old truth. The ocean was too vast, too strong, and in a moment of fear, humans made a choice that doomed them. Picture the silence after. The storm passes, the sea calms, the sun rises. The brigantine drifts, intact. The lifeboat is gone. On board, the beds remain unmade. The sewing kit lies open. The log stops mid-sentence. The ship becomes a floating riddle. And the ocean, vast and eternal, swallows every trace of the people who once filled her with breath and laughter. That is the most merciless truth of all. The natural enemies of sailors are not pirates or mutineers. They are the waves, the wind, the invisible hand of the sea. Against them, even the strongest timbers and the bravest hearts sometimes fail. And when they do, the ocean keeps its silence. Chapter 8. The Cargo's Secret. The Mary Celeste was not an empty vessel when she left New York. Deep in her hold lay the heart of her voyage, 1701 barrels of industrial alcohol, bound for Genoa. To a casual eye, it was just cargo, another commodity in a world forever shipping goods across oceans. But this cargo was not like cotton or timber or grain. It was volatile, unpredictable, dangerous. Alcohol of this kind was not the refined drink that filled tavern mugs. It was raw, undiluted, meant for cleaning, for fueling, for industry. Clear, sharp, and fiercely flammable. Sailors knew its dangers. A single spark, a dropped lantern, a careless match could transform the hold into an inferno. To carry such cargo across the Atlantic was to sail with a sleeping beast chained beneath the decks. When the de Gracia's men opened the hatches and climbed down, the stench was overwhelming. 9 barrels had leaked, their staves swollen, seams split. Alcohol seeped into the planks, soaked the air with invisible fumes. Even a lantern seemed dangerous in that close space. To breathe was to risk dizziness, nausea, panic. Imagine it, the reek-filling lungs, searing nostrils, clinging to clothing. A crew forced to live above such a menace for weeks might see disaster where none yet burned. What did Briggs think when he discovered the leaks? Did he walk the hold, lantern lifted, handkerchief pressed to his nose, and feel his heart sink? Did he picture Sarah and Sophia asleep above, their breathing shallow in air poisoned by fumes? Did he imagine the ship bursting suddenly into flame? No warning, no chance of escape. If so, the lifeboat must have looked less like retreat and more like salvation. The barrels themselves tell another story. They were American oak, porous, poorly suited to holding industrial spirits. European buyers often complained that American casks leaked. In Genoa, merchants were ready to receive the cargo, But the Mary Celeste never arrived. Instead, the leaking barrels became a ghostly clue, a thread investigators would follow. Some suggested that the alcohol actually ignited, that a small explosion shook the ship, perhaps blowing open hatches, filling the air with fireless thunder. It would not have left scorch marks, not necessarily, but it could have terrified everyone aboard. The crew, convinced the ship was about to erupt in flames, might have abandoned her immediately. And yet, when the ship was found, there were no burn scars, no shattered timbers. The barrels leaked, yes, but they had not destroyed. There is a cruel irony here. The danger was real, but perhaps not fatal. The fumes might have been strong enough to frighten, but not enough to kill. An explosion might have been loud, but not lethal. The cargo was treacherous, but the ship was still sound. The greater danger was not the alcohol itself, but the fear it inspired. Fear is a kind of cargo too. It rides silently with every voyage, stowed away in the minds of men. A storm rattles, timbers fear whispers, the ship will break. A rope snaps, fear says the mast will fall. Alcohol leaks, fear hisses of fire, of suffocation, of doom. Fear turns possibility into certainty, and certainty into action. Briggs was not a man easily swayed, but he was a man with a wife and child aboard. It is one thing to risk your own life for duty. It is another to risk the lives of those you love. Perhaps in another voyage, without Sarah and Sophia, he might have trusted his ship, sealed the barrels, endured the stench. But with them aboard, the calculation shifted. His responsibility deepened. His promise to protect was no longer just professional, it was personal, sacred. The cargo of alcohol was not simply freight. It was a burden of fear pressing on his mind. Every creak of the hull, every strange smell in the cabin, every flicker of lantern light might have whispered of imminent catastrophe. Day by day, mile by mile, that weight grew heavier. Until at last, one choice, the lifeboat, seemed the only way to keep that promise. And yet, once again, the cruel paradox returns. The ship survived. The barrels sat, leaking but harmless. The fumes dispersed. The danger was real but not fatal. The abandonment, not the cargo, sealed the fate of those aboard. The secret of the Mary Celeste's cargo is that it was not only alcohol. It was fear, bottled tight, seeping into every decision. Fear of fire. Fear of suffocation. Fear of breaking a captain's promise. And when that fear spilled out, like liquid through the staves of a leaking cask, it carried the crew away with it. The barrels remained. The cargo stayed. Only the people vanished. And so the Mary Celeste drifted on, full of alcohol, full of silence, empty of life. A ship not destroyed by fire, but by the fear of fire. Chapter 9. The Human Mind. The sea tests more than wood and canvas. It tests the human mind. A ship may be sturdy, her sails trimmed, her cargo secure, but if fear takes root among her people, the voyage already in danger. Sailors know this truth as well as storms. Sometimes the greatest enemy is not wind or water, but the quiet unraveling of reason. On the Mary Celeste, the conditions for such unraveling were present. A long voyage, isolation from land, the monotony of endless horizons, the stench of leaking alcohol seeping into every breath. Add to this the presence of a child, a reminder of innocence, a constant source of worry, and you have a tinderbox, not of wood, but of nerves. Imagine the crew in those final days. The logbook silent. The ship steady, yet something gnawing at the edges of calm. Men glancing at one another, their conversations hushed, their laughter strained. The reek of spirits from the hold thickening the air. Each breath a reminder of the danger below. When barrels leak, no one feels safe. They may not ignite, but the possibility hovers like a shadow. Every lantern flame flickers with threat. Every accidental spark becomes a prophecy. The human mind does not require catastrophe to collapse. It requires only the imagination of catastrophe. And sailors have fertile imaginations. They live in a world of omens, where shadows in the water hint at monsters, where sudden calm whispers of curses. The Atlantic in 1872 was still a place of superstition. Men nailed horseshoes above doors, carried charms against storms, whispered prayers into the wind. Fear grows quickly in such soil. Now, picture Captain Briggs. A man of faith, yes, but also a man burdened. He carried not only the duty of a captain, but the weight of his wife's eyes, his child's laughter. Every groan of the hull might have sounded louder to him, every shift of the ship more threatening. What if the fumes reached the cabin and poisoned Sarah in her sleep? What if little Sophia coughed, her lungs filled with vapor? What if a single spark, struck by accident, consumed them all before he could act? The mind, once caught in such loops, cannot easily escape. Rationally, he might know the ship was sound, but reason drowns when fear rises. And fear of losing a child, a wife, fear of breaking the most sacred promise of protection, can eclipse every calculation. The crew, too, were not immune. They looked to their captain for certainty. But even the hint of doubt in his eyes, even a pause too long before an order, could plant seeds of panic. Men talk. They whisper in the dark. They share their fears like smuggled contraband, and soon those fears grow larger than the sea itself. Perhaps one man coughed from the fumes. Another swore he smelled fire. A third claimed he heard a hiss, like gas escaping. Panic is contagious. It leaps from man to man faster than any flame. And when it spreads, it drives people to act in ways they would never imagine on calm shores. We must not imagine madness as sudden screams or wild eyes. Madness at sea often looks quieter. It is the subtle erosion of trust, the tightening of jaws, the restless eyes scanning horizon and hatch alike. It is the silence between orders, the glances exchanged when no one thinks the captain sees. And then, when tension grows unbearable, it is a single decision that tips all into chaos. Lower the boat. Leave the ship. Flee the invisible enemy. It is not hard to imagine Briggs giving the order. Not as a wild-eyed maniac, but as a father, a husband, a leader pressed by fear he could not banish. Perhaps, he said, we'll wait it out in the boat. Just for a while. Perhaps he meant it as precaution, not abandonment. But the Atlantic has little patience for half measures. A rope snapped, a current pulled, a gust-separated boat from brigantine. In minutes, the Mary Celeste was a ghost, and the lifeboat was a speck swallowed by waves. This is the cruelest truth about the human mind at sea. Decisions are made not in calm reflection, but in storms of emotion. And even the wisest, most devout, most competent captain is still a man, subject to doubt, to fear, to love that clouds judgment. Briggs was not weak. He was human. And humanity is fragile when faced with the vast indifference of the ocean. We want certainty. We want villains or monsters or storms to blame. But perhaps the Mary Celeste offers something far more chilling, the reminder that sometimes tragedy needs no grand cause. Sometimes it is enough for fear to win, for the mind to falter, for the promise of safety to dissolve into the silence of the sea. And so the ship drifted on, intact, unbroken, mocking the frailty of human reason. Her timbers strong, her cargo heavy, her provisions plentiful yet abandoned because the minds aboard could not endure the invisible weight pressing on them. She carried no mutiny, no fire, no storm. She carried only the most dangerous cargo of all, fear inside human hearts. When the day-gracious sailors walked her decks and found her empty, they did not see madness. But madness leaves no stains. It lingers only in the silence, in the absence, in the questions that echo louder than any voice. And those questions still echo now. Chapter 10. The Myths That Followed. When the Mary Celeste reached Gibraltar under tow, she was no longer just a ship. She was an empty stage, and into that void the world rushed with stories. News of her abandonment spread quickly, carried by telegraph wires, and inked in bold headlines. For newspapers, the ghost ship was a gift. Mystery sells better than certainty. And in the absence of answers, speculation bloomed like weeds in the cracks of fact. Imagine yourself in a cafe in London in early 1873 sipping coffee while turning the pages of the Times or a local penny paper. There, tucked between columns on Parliament and crime reports, is a tantalizing headline. Ship found adrift. Crew vanished without a trace. Your eyes widen. The words carry a chill. A ship intact, provisions on board, cargo untouched, yet not a soul aboard. It sounds less like news and more like a ghost story. And so it was read, repeated, reshaped. The inquiry in Gibraltar, instead of extinguishing speculation, fanned it. The court had no answer. They could not say why Briggs and his crew had left. And into that silence, rumor slipped easily. Some whispered the crew of the Dei Gratia had murdered them, concocting the story for salvage money. Others swore pirates had struck and been frightened away. A few suggested darker forces that the ship had sailed into a cursed patch of sea where reason and nature faltered. The newspapers knew their audience. Dry fact would not sell. Mystery would. They described the abandoned ship in chilling prose, her sails tattered, her deck empty, her cabins eerily intact. They lingered on the detail of the untouched meal, the captain's rumpled bed, the child's toys. Such images burned themselves into memory, haunting precisely because they suggest presence interrupted. People leaned forward as they read, imagining the laughter of a child echoing in corridors, now silent. In taverns and on docks, the story spread like wildfire. Sailors told it with embellishment. One claimed he had spoken to a man who had seen the ship drifting with ghostly figures at the rail. Another swore barrels of blood were found in the hold. None of it true, but truth mattered little. What mattered was the thrill, the chill, the way the story tapped into an ancient fear, that the sea could erase not just lives, but explanations. By the time the story crossed the Atlantic again, it had grown. In New York, some newspapers suggested Sarah Briggs had gone mad and murdered the crew before leaping into the waves with her daughter. Others hinted at mutiny, framing Briggs as victim of betrayal. Still others suggested the cargo itself had poisoned the crew. Each version offered readers not certainty, but drama. And readers could choose whichever suited their taste. This is the power of myth. The Mary Celeste was not the first ship to be found derelict, but she became the most famous because the details were so perfect for imagination. An intact ship, a vanished family, a missing logbook, and no clear cause what storyteller could resist? She was a blank canvas, and everyone painted their fears upon her. As years passed, the myth hardened. Children heard it as a cautionary tale. Writers retold it with Gothic flair. Sailors swapped it as proof the sea was haunted. And each retelling added shadows until the facts were almost forgotten. She was no longer a brigantine hauling alcohol. She was a phantom, cursed, doomed to drift forever in story, if not in reality. There is something almost inevitable about this. Human beings crave narrative. We cannot endure silence. We must fill it. And the Mary Celeste was silence, incarnate, decks empty, cabins waiting, logbook closed. The world rushed to supply voices where none remained. Pirates, madness, ghosts, sea monsters, divine wrath, all were tried on like costumes. The ship bore them all because she could not protest. Even now, ask a stranger about the Mary Celeste, and you will hear not fact, but myth. They will speak of food left on the table as though it were steaming hot. It was not. They will say the ship was perfectly intact, not a sail torn, not true. They will whisper of lifeboats cut away violently, of blood on the deck, imaginations, not evidence. The real Mary Celeste was strange enough. But myth demanded she be stranger still. And perhaps this is why her story endures. Facts grow old, but myths do not. Facts fade, replaced by newer ones, while myths dig roots into the collective mind. The Mary Celeste was not the greatest disaster at sea. She did not sink with hundreds. She did not change history. But she did something rarer. She left a question. And questions, especially those that cannot be answered, live forever. It is not hard to picture Briggs, Sarah, Sophia, and the crew walking the deck one last time. Their feet real, their hands rough, their hearts beating. Yet in our minds, they have become characters, almost ghostly already. We do not see them as they were, ordinary men and women on a voyage. We see them as myth, eternal passengers in a story told across centuries. The Mary Celeste may have drifted into Gibraltar's harbor that December, but in truth, she drifted straight into legend. And once a story enters legend, it no longer belongs only to those who lived it. It belongs to all of us, reshaped each time we whisper it again. Chapter 11. Echoes in Literature. There is a curious alchemy that happens when history slips into the hands of storytellers. A true event, however strange, is fragile. It exists in documents, in testimony, in brittle pages of reports. But when a writer seizes it, the story hardens into something more enduring, more malleable, more powerful. The Mary Celeste crossed that threshold sooner than most. She did not remain confined to maritime reports. She drifted into the pages of fiction, where imagination could roam free. It happened only a few years after the ship was found. In 1884, a young physician named Arthur Conan Doyle, years before he would conjure Sherlock Holmes, published a story titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. It was a short tale, framed as a testimony, and in it Doyle reshaped the Mary Celeste into something darker, stranger, and more thrilling. He changed her name to Mary Celeste, a mistake or invention that would itself become part of the legend, repeated so often that many people now know her only by that altered name. In Doyle's version, the ship was found with all crew vanished, but he added sinister detail. He wrote of fresh meals on the table, cups of tea still warm, a scene of sudden disappearance so eerie it seared itself into imagination. He invented characters, motives, mysteries. The story was printed anonymously, and many readers at first believed it was a factual account, a true explanation of the mystery. Newspapers reprinted it. Readers shivered over it. The ghost ship was no longer merely real, it was literary. Doyle was not alone. Other writers, sensing the allure, wove the Mary Celeste into their works. Magazines thrilled their audiences with half-true retellings, mixing fact with invention. Cheap pamphlets, penny dreadfuls, spread lurid versions of the tale. Some claimed mutiny, some madness, some supernatural forces. The details shifted, but the tone remained the same, fear and fascination in equal measure. The irony is sharp. The real Mary Celeste, with her logbooks and barrels of alcohol, was strange enough. But literature demanded she be stranger. Doyle's warm tea, detail entirely invented, still lingers today in popular retellings. People repeat it as fact, proof of the uncanny. And each generation of storytellers added new flourishes until the ghost ship became more fiction than truth. But that is the nature of stories at sea. Sailors themselves are storytellers, spinning yarns by lamplight, turning storms into sagas. Doyle and his peers were only extending that tradition onto paper. The Mary Celeste became not a failed voyage, but a vessel of imagination, a canvas upon which writers painted their fears and readers projected their wonder. It is worth pausing to consider why this story, above others, took such root. Many ships were found derelict. Many mysteries remain unsolved. Why did this one endure? Perhaps because of its balance. It contained enough fact to ground belief in actual ship, an actual captain, an actual disappearance, and enough absence to invite invention. Too many facts smother imagination. Too few make a tale collapse into myth alone. The Mary Celeste had just enough of both. As Doyle's fame grew with Sherlock Holmes, his early ghost ship tale was remembered and reprinted. And each time, the distinction between history and fiction blurred further. Readers of the late 19th century, already fascinated by spiritualism, seances, and the idea of unseen worlds, embraced the ship as proof that the sea held secrets beyond comprehension. The Mary Celeste became a touchstone in that cultural appetite for mystery. Even serious historians, trying to correct the record, found themselves competing with the stronger pull of story. Facts could not undo Doyle's invention. People preferred the eerie image of steaming cups on a table, of a ship paused in mid-life, abandoned without reason. They preferred the ghost to the truth. And so the ship lived on in books, articles, pulp magazines, and later in films and television. Each medium took her further from Gibraltar's courtroom, further from the Atlantic swells of 1872. She became less a vessel of timber and more a vessel of imagination. By the 20th century, she was shorthand for mystery itself. To invoke the Mary Celeste was to evoke disappearance, the uncanny, the unsolved. This is the strange immortality of the Mary Celeste. The real people Briggs, Sarah, Sophia, Richardson, Lawrenson, the nameless sailors are often forgotten, their lives overshadowed. But the ship itself, carried by the pens of writers, remains vivid. In Doyle's hands, she was transformed, and in that transformation, she found eternity. It is tempting to feel frustrated by this, to want to peel back the layers of myth and return to truth, to insist that the ship was real, the cargo was alcohol, the log stopped on November 25th, the lifeboat was gone. But perhaps we should allow the myths their place. For myths are how humans honor silence. When we cannot know, we imagine. And imagination keeps the vanished alive in a way that dry fact cannot. The Mary Celeste drifts still, not on the Atlantic, but across the pages of literature. She is no longer only a ship found abandoned. She is a ghost vessel, haunting the boundary between history and story. And it is there, in that uncertain space, that she endures. Chapter 12. The Ship That Wouldn't Die. For most ships, the story ends when the crew vanishes. An empty vessel once discovered would normally be sold, dismantled, or quietly forgotten. But the Mary Celeste did not allow herself such an ordinary fate. She lingered, stubborn, restless, a ship that refused to die. After Gibraltar, she was repaired, refitted, and sent back to sea. Imagine the irony. A ship already famous as a ghost, loaded once more with cargo, crewed by men who could not possibly ignore her reputation. To step aboard her was to step aboard a question. Sailors are superstitious, and many hesitated. Some swore they would never sail her. Others, driven by wages, agreed but uneasily. They whispered prayers as they crossed her deck, touched talismans, muttered that she was cursed. And perhaps she was. For though she sailed for many years after her infamous voyage, misfortune clung to her. She never quite prospered. Owners changed. Profits dwindled. Voyages were plagued by trouble storms, delays, cargo damaged. Always she seemed to carry with her an aura of unease. Her name alone, by now twisted often into Mary Celeste, was enough to unsettle. She had become an omen, a floating reminder that some mysteries cannot be resolved. By the 1880s, she had slipped from respectable trade into something less noble. She was no longer the proud brigantine Briggs had commanded, family aboard, sails taut with promise. She had become shabby, a vessel of bad luck. Owners sold her on, each eager to rid themselves of her shadow. Some tried to use her, others tried to profit from her legend, but none succeeded. Her final voyage came in 1885. By then, she was under the command of a man named Gilman C. Parker. Parker was no Briggs. He was not remembered for steadiness or piety. Instead, his name would be tied to greed and recklessness. For Parker devised a scheme. He would deliberately wreck the Mary Celeste in the Caribbean, claim her as lost, and collect the insurance. A fraud, plain and simple. And so the cursed ship, already burdened by legend, found herself steered not by fate but by deliberate betrayal. She sailed toward Haiti, laden with a cargo of cheap goods, bought at inflated value for the swindle. Parker and his associates intended to ground her, abandon her, and return to claim the money. But if Parker thought he could control the ghost ship, he was mistaken. The Mary Celeste grounded on a reef off the coast of Haiti. The crash must have echoed like judgment. Her hull cracked, timbers splintered, waves pounding her broken body. The crew, complicit in the plot, abandoned her. There she lay, battered by the surf, her career ended not in quiet retirement, but in ruin. The insurance fraud was discovered. Parker was tried, disgraced, his name cursed. And the ship herself was left to rot on the reef, her timbers bleaching in the tropical sun, her legend sealed. There is something fitting about that end. She had been abandoned before, once mysteriously, once deliberately. She had carried silence, fear, and myth across the Atlantic. And when she finally came to rest, it was through betrayal, greed, and ruin. A ship that had once symbolized enigma now symbolized folly. But death did not silence her. Even wrecked, she lived on. Writers invoked her. Sailors whispered of her. Children read about her in cheap story papers. The name: Mary Celeste. Or Mary Celeste, thanks to Doyle's enduring slip, remained a byword for mystery. She became a metaphor, invoked whenever something vanished without trace. A drifting ship. A missing traveler. A mystery unsolved. Always, the comparison was the same, like the Mary Celeste. In this way, she transcended her wood and nails. She became more than a vessel. She became a story, a ghost carried not by the sea but by words. It is strange to think of her wrecked on that reef, her planks splintered, her cargo spoiled, her sails gone. Birds nested in her timbers. Fish darted through her broken ribs. The ocean slowly claimed her, piece by piece, until she was nothing but memory. And yet, in minds and in pages, she was more alive than ever. Perhaps that is her final trick. Most ships die twice, once when they break, once when they are forgotten. The Mary Celeste has died only once. Her second death, oblivion, has never come. She lives still, a ghost forever drifting, not on waves but in imagination. Stand on the coast of Haiti today, where waves crash against hidden reefs, and you will not see her timbers. They are long gone, swallowed by sea and time. But if you listen in the roar of surf, in the hiss of wind, you might hear an echo. Not of wood breaking, but of silence, the silence of an empty deck, a missing logbook, a promise broken, a legend born. And maybe that is why her story refuses to end. She is the ship that would not die, because some mysteries are too perfect to let go. The Mary Celeste is gone now. Her timbers rotted, her planks scattered, her final resting place somewhere on a reef beneath Haitian waves. Her people are gone too, their names carved only faintly into records, their bodies never returned. The Atlantic kept them, as it has kept so many. And yet, she remains. Not in wood, but in memory. Not in sails, but in stories. What makes her endure is not only the mystery of her abandonment, but the silence that followed. That silence has been filled with theories, with novels, with whispers. It has been painted in ink by Arthur Conan Doyle, murmured in taverns by sailors, repeated in classrooms, dramatized in documentaries. Each telling reshapes her, and each retelling keeps her alive. In the end, perhaps the truth matters less than the story. Perhaps the reason we still speak her name is not because we believe we will solve her, but because we cannot let her go. She is a reminder that not every question has an answer, not every disappearance can be explained, and not every silence can be broken. Stand on any shore and watch the horizon. Out there, the sea still waits, vast and indifferent. And somewhere in its eternal silence, the Mary Celeste drifts on, not in timber and sail, but in restless tides of imagination.